Hello. After a long and exhausting day, it's time to slow down, clear your mind, and let the outside world gradually fade away. Find a comfortable place, dim the lights, and allow yourself to relax as tonight's dark and mysterious stories begin. Just remember, some stories stay with you long after the night is over. For 6 mornings in a row, I found the same blue index card folded inside my coat pocket. The message was written in my own handwriting. Her name is Mara Venn. Do not let them close drawer 18. I had no memory of writing it. I had never met anyone named Mara Venn, and the records annex where I worked did not have a drawer 18, at least, not according to the floor plan taped beside the elevator. That was in February of 2014, during the coldest winter Greywater County had seen in nearly 20 years. I was 39 and working a temporary night contract in the old courthouse records annex outside Bellwether, Missouri. The county had moved most of its paper files there after a water line burst beneath the courthouse and soaked 3 basement storage rooms. My job was simple. I worked from 10 at night until 6 in the morning, scanning damaged employment files and entering the surviving information into a new digital system. It was quiet work, which suited me. I had spent the previous year avoiding people who knew why I had left my last position with the state. The official reason was a procedural violation. The real reason was that I had changed the received date on a legal filing after my supervisor missed a deadline. When the mistake was discovered, a younger clerk named Brendan Cole took the blame because his initials were on the routing sheet. I could have corrected the record. I did not. The annex had once been a garment factory. Long rows of steel shelving stood beneath fluorescent lights, and the windows had been painted over. At night, the darkness between the shelves seemed to add distance. There were only 2 other people scheduled during my shift. Lou Baines handled maintenance and security, and Denise Harlan, the record supervisor, usually stayed until midnight before driving home. Denise was careful, organized, and openly suspicious of temporary workers. She gave me a ring of brass keys and told me 3 rules on my first night. Never use the freight elevator after 2 in the morning. Never remove a paper file from the annex. And if a drawer was marked for destruction, I was to scan the cover sheet only, then place the entire folder in the red bin. I asked what qualified a file for destruction. Duplicates, she said. Bad transfers. People entered twice. Things that should never have been retained. The first blue card appeared 2 weeks after I started. That morning I assumed it was a joke. I showed it to Lou before I left. He was sitting at the security desk with a thermos between his hands. "Do we have a Mara Venn working here?" I asked. Lou read the card twice. His expression did not change, but he rubbed his thumb along the edge as if checking the thickness of the paper. "No," he said. "Never heard the name." When he handed it back, the message was gone. The card was still blue, the fold was still there, but both sides were blank. Lou told me the copier toner sometimes left residue on cards stored near the machine. It made no sense, but I was tired enough to accept any explanation that allowed me to go home. The next night, at 11 minutes past 2, the freight elevator bell rang. The elevator was at the far end of the building behind the archive cages. Denise had told me not to use it after 2, but she had never said what to do if it came up by itself. I found the doors open on an empty car. A gray metal cart stood inside. It held 7 brown personnel folders tied with cotton tape. There was no shipping sheet and no county transfer label. The top folder belonged to a woman named Mara Venn. Her employment date was listed as August 1993. Her position was temporary night records clerk. The photograph clipped inside showed a woman in her early 30s with dark hair pulled behind her ears. She wore the same gray county sweater Denise kept in the supply cabinet. The final page was a separation notice. The reason given was not resignation, termination, or death. It read, "Position reconciled. Individual no longer retained in active memory." I thought it was an old clerical code, perhaps something left over from a payroll system that no longer existed. I entered Mara's name into the database. No result. I checked the county directory, pension index, and local obituaries. Nothing came back. It was as if the name had never been used in Greywater County. At 4 in the morning, I heard someone moving boxes in aisle 18. The annex aisles were numbered only to 17. The sound came from beyond the last row, where the shelving ended against a painted brick wall. I walked toward it and saw a narrow passage I had never noticed. A single fluorescent tube burned above it. At the end stood a green filing cabinet with 18 shallow drawers. A woman was kneeling in front of the bottom drawer. She wore a gray county sweater. Her hair was pulled behind her ears. "You scanned my cover sheet," she said without looking at me. Her voice was calm, almost tired. I asked how she had entered the building. She ignored the question and held up a blue index card. The card had my name written across the top. "Did you bring the folders upstairs?" I asked.
No,
She said. "The building sends up whatever it thinks you're ready to forget." I should have called Lou. Instead, I stood there while she opened the bottom drawer. Inside were hundreds of blue cards arranged by year. Every card held a name, a job title, and a date. Some included short notes in different kinds of handwriting. Remembered the tune he whistled near the boiler room. Left-handed, gold wedding band. Always brought oranges on Thursdays. Afraid of thunderstorms but never admitted it. They were not employment records. They were reminders. Mara told me not to scan anything from the green cabinet. She said the paper files upstairs had already been reduced to names and dates. Once the last personal detail was converted into county data, the person was lost completely. "Lost how?" I asked. She looked at me then. "The way you lost Brendan Cole." I had not told anyone in Bellwether about Brendan. The lights went out for perhaps 3 seconds. When they came back, I was alone at the brick wall. There was no passage, no cabinet, and no 18th aisle. At 6 that morning, I found the second blue card in my pocket. Her name is Mara Venn. Do not let them close drawer 18. This time I photographed it before showing anyone. By noon, the photograph on my phone showed a blank card. Over the next 4 nights, the pattern repeated. At 11 minutes past 2, the elevator arrived with personnel folders for people from different decades. None existed in any digital system. At 4, the passage appeared beyond aisle 17. Sometimes Mara was there. Sometimes I found only the green cabinet and the faint smell of cold dust. Each morning, most of what I had learned was gone. I began writing notes in pencil because ink disappeared first. I hid cards under my watch band and inside my shoes. The words faded by sunrise, but the pressure marks sometimes remained. Mara Venn. Drawer 18. Do not scan the final card. I stopped sleeping during the day. I covered the walls of my apartment with names. By evening, I would look at them and feel nothing. They seemed like shopping lists written by a stranger. Lou noticed the change in me. He asked whether I was drinking. Denise asked whether I was taking medication. I told them I was adjusting to nights. On the 7th shift, I searched the annex before midnight. Behind a row of obsolete payroll ledgers, I found a narrow maintenance cabinet locked with a key from my ring. Inside was a black book wrapped in waxed cloth. It was a handwritten staffing ledger covering the years from 1958 to 1996. Most entries were ordinary, but every few pages, a night employee had been crossed out with a ruler straight line. Beside each name was the same phrase, removed to preserve continuity. Near the back of the ledger, I found a memorandum signed by a county administrator in September 1993. That was the year the river flooded downtown and the courthouse basement filled with muddy water. The memorandum described an emergency records crew assigned to work overnight. 7 temporary employees had handled damaged files for 19 days. According to the memo, the workers discovered discrepancies between payroll records and the physical number of people in the building. The final paragraph was written in a different hand. When the archive retains a person whom the county has omitted, all connected records begin to divide. Witnesses remember conflicting lives. Families report additional rooms, photographs, and histories. To prevent recurrence, no omitted person may be permanently remembered. Below that paragraph were 7 names. Mara Venn was the last. I thought I understood then. I believed Mara and the others had died during the flood, and the county had erased their records to avoid responsibility. The passage, the cabinet, and the night folders were only remnants of that crime, repeating because the truth had never been entered properly. It was an explanation I could live with. Human wrongdoing made more sense to me than a building that decided what people were allowed to remember. I planned to scan the ledger, copy it to a personal drive, and send everything to the state auditor. At 3:30, Denise returned unexpectedly. She came through the front entrance without removing her coat. Snow had collected on her shoulders. Lou followed several steps behind her, looking pale. Denise saw the black ledger beside my scanner. "You opened the maintenance cabinet," she said. It was not a question. I told her I had found evidence of missing employees. I said the county had concealed something in 1993. Denise sat across from me. For the first time since I had met her, she looked older than her age. "No one died in the flood," she said. "That would have been easier." Lou placed a red destruction bin beside my chair. Denise explained that the annex held employment cards from the county's poorhouse, road crews, prison farm, and public hospital. Many workers had been paid in cash or left off official reports. Once those records were stored together, people began remembering co-workers who had never officially existed. At first, it caused small disagreements. Then families remembered different marriages, houses gained extra bedrooms, and graves changed names. The county learned that memory followed the most complete record. If an omitted person was described in enough detail, the world made space for them. But the space had to come from somewhere. Denise opened the ledger to a page I had not seen. My name was written there. Beside it was my start date at the annex and a separation date of February 12, 2014, the following day. Under reason, someone had written, "Excess witness, reconcile before sunrise." I asked who had entered it. Denise said I had. She took 6 blue cards from her coat pocket and laid them on the table. All were blank, but when she angled them beneath the scanner light, I saw the pressure marks of my handwriting. On 3 previous mornings, I had remembered Mara long enough to reach the same decision. I had opened drawer 18 and tried to restore her file. Each time, the archive had begun making room for her by removing me. Denise and Lou had stopped me before sunrise. They had returned Mara's card to the drawer and destroyed my notes. By morning, I remembered none of it. The blue cards in my pocket were the parts they had missed. I asked Denise why she remembered. "She doesn't," Lou said. He opened his thermos and removed a rolled strip of paper sealed in plastic. It contained instructions in his own handwriting. Denise had similar notes sewn into the lining of her coat. They did not remember Mara. They remembered the procedure. At 4, the passage appeared. None of us spoke as we walked beyond aisle 17. The green cabinet stood beneath the humming light. Mara was waiting beside it. She looked at Denise and Lou without recognition. Then she looked at me. "You always come back to this part," she said. I opened drawer 18. My blue card was at the front. Mara's was behind it. The details on hers were fading. Her handwriting, her habit of bringing oranges on Thursdays, the small scar beside her right thumb, her fear of thunderstorms. One by one, the sentences were becoming shallow impressions. Denise handed me the red bin. If I destroyed Mara's card, the archive would stop adjusting. By sunrise, I would keep my name, my job, and every life connected to mine. No one would remember Mara, including me. If I scanned her card, the archive would accept her as retained. Mara would return to the county's history. Records would change. Memories would change. Space would be made. This time, I knew whose space it would take. I thought about Brendan Cole. I remembered how easy it had been to let a record decide which one of us would carry the damage. I had told myself that silence was not the same as lying. I had told myself that keeping my job mattered because I could correct things later. Later had become a year. I placed Mara's card on the scanner. Denise reached for my wrist, but Lou stopped her. The scanner light moved slowly beneath the glass. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the annex filled with ordinary sounds. Phones ringing in distant offices, shoes crossing tile floors, a woman laughing somewhere below us, paper sliding into metal trays. The building sounded occupied by decades of night workers, all performing the small tasks that had once been removed from the official account. The digital screen populated with Mara's name. Then mine disappeared. I did not vanish. There was no pain and no sudden darkness. But Denise looked at me with the polite confusion people reserve for strangers in restricted buildings. Lou asked who had let me inside. Mara touched my sleeve. "I remember you," she said. That was the consequence I had not understood. Restoring her did not erase me from the world. It erased me from the county's retained history. My employment records vanished first, then my lease, my bank account, and every document connected to a Greywater County address. People outside the county still knew me, but inside its borders, I became difficult to hold in mind. I left before sunrise with the black ledger under my coat. The state investigation uncovered decades of false payroll reports and missing employment files, though the official findings said nothing about altered memory. Brendan Cole's record was corrected after I submitted a written confession. I never returned to state work. Mara Venn appeared in the county directory the same week. According to the new records, she had worked at the annex until 1997, then moved to another state. No one could explain why her personnel photograph showed a woman who had not aged since 1993. I have not been back to Bellwether. I still carry a blue card in my wallet. Most days it is blank. But every February, on the night before the 12th, pencil marks rise slowly from the paper. They always form the same sentence. Mara remembers me. The first time the ferry called my name, the harbor had been closed for 3 days. A hard northeast wind had pushed Lake Superior over the lower pier, and every boat tied at St. Cary's Island was either hauled inland or chained to concrete. There was no reason for anyone to request docking clearance at 2:17 in the morning. Even the medical launch had been moved to the protected side of the island. Still, the radio on my desk clicked once, and a man's voice came through the static. "North Landing, this is the Maribel. We have 1 passenger to return." Then he said my full name. That happened in October of 2001, when I was 44 and working the overnight harbor watch for the island township. St. Cary's sat several miles off Michigan's Upper Peninsula, far enough from the mainland that weather controlled nearly every part of life. By late October, the rental cottages were empty, the ferry schedule had been cut to 2 runs a day, and most waterfront windows were dark before 10. My shift ran from midnight until 8. I monitored the pier alarms, recorded lake conditions, and kept the marine radio open for emergencies. It was quiet work for someone who knew the harbor and did not mind being alone. I had lived on the island most of my life. I knew which pilings groaned when the water rose and which doors swelled in wet weather. I also knew how to avoid conversations about my husband. People said Eli had left 8 years earlier after a bad winter and a worse marriage. That was the version I told as well. He had packed a canvas bag, taken the mainland ferry, and never come back. Our daughter, Ruth, had been 19 then. She moved to Green Bay within a year and called only on Sundays, when both of us could pretend distance was ordinary. There were pieces of Eli's departure I could not clearly remember. I knew we had argued. I knew a red wool scarf had gone missing from the hook beside the kitchen door. I knew the harbor bell had rung after midnight, though the bell had been disconnected for years. Whenever I tried to arrange those details into a single night, my thoughts seemed to slide away from one another. The radio call brought them close. I asked the vessel to repeat its name, position, and passenger count. "The Maribel," the man said. "1 to return, no one to collect." The vessel registry contained no Maribel. The Coast Guard station on the mainland reported nothing on radar within 10 miles of St. Cary's. When I returned to the harbor frequency, the channel was silent. I wrote the call in the overnight log and went outside. The wind had dropped. 10 minutes earlier, spray had struck the office windows like gravel. Now the lake lay flat beyond the breakwater, and fog-filled air too cold and dry to hold it. At the far end of the north pier, the old boarding bell moved once. It made no sound. I walked halfway down the pier with a flashlight. The beam showed wet boards, black water, and a line of empty cleats. Then a low horn sounded inside the fog. It was not loud. I felt it more in the wood beneath my boots than in the air. A white light appeared, followed by a ferry approaching without wake. It looked older than any vessel still operating on the lake, with narrow wheelhouse windows and a faded green stripe along the bow. No engine noise followed it. The ferry stopped beside the pier with impossible precision. A deckhand in a dark wool coat stepped down with a rope. His face was pale from cold, not death, and he looked at me as if we had worked together before. "You kept the office open," he said. I asked where they had come from. "Across," he said. There was no island across from St. Caris in that direction. There was only open lake and, much farther north, Canada. A single passenger came down the gangway. She was an elderly woman in a tan raincoat. I recognized her as Mrs. Bell, who lived above the pharmacy on Cedar Street. I had seen her buying apples that afternoon. She carried a small paper claim check between two fingers. The deckhand took it from her, tore it in half, and placed both pieces in his coat pocket. Mrs. Bell stepped onto the pier. She looked at me without recognition and began walking toward town. I called after her. She did not turn. When I looked back, the ferry was already moving away. The line had been untied without anyone touching it. Fog closed behind the stern, and the wind returned so suddenly that I had to grip the railing. Back in the office, the wall clock read 2:18. Only 1 minute had passed. In the morning, I showed the log entry to my supervisor, Frank Dallow. He had worked the harbor since before I finished high school. He read the line about the Maribel and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "You were tired," he said. I told him about Mrs. Bell. Frank closed the logbook. "Go home, Nora." He had never used that tone with me. It was not anger. It was fear shaped into a command. I stopped at the pharmacy before going home. Mrs. Bell was behind the counter arranging greeting cards. She knew me immediately. She asked whether I was sleeping well and reminded me that Ruth's birthday was coming. When I mentioned seeing her at the pier, she laughed. "I haven't been down there since Arthur died," she said. Arthur had been her husband. He had drowned near the North Breakwater in 1986. Then she paused with one hand resting on the card display. "Was Arthur wearing his brown coat?" she asked. I said I had not seen him. Her expression changed. She looked toward the shop window as if someone had passed outside. "I don't know why I asked that," she said. The second call came 4 nights later. The weather was clear, the lake calm. At 2:17, the radio clicked. "North Landing. This is the Maribel. We have 3 passengers to return." This time the voice did not say my name. I locked the harbor office and stayed inside. I told myself that fatigue, isolation, and the steady hum of electrical equipment had combined into something that felt real. I watched the pier through the window. Fog gathered beyond the breakwater. The ferry arrived. 3 people came ashore. A middle-aged man from the hardware store, a woman who taught 2nd grade, a boy of perhaps 16 whom I did not recognize. Each carried a claim check, each surrendered it to the same deckhand. The boy stopped beneath the harbor light and looked directly at me through the office window. He raised his hand. Around his wrist was a red strip of wool. The next morning, the hardware store owner could not remember the summer his building burned. The teacher no longer remembered the daughter who had died 2 days after birth. Photographs, newspaper notices, and a brass plaque proved both events had happened. The memories had not disappeared from the island. They had disappeared only from the people who had lived them. The boy was harder to identify. I described him to Frank. He listened without interrupting, then asked me to come into the storage room behind his office. The room held old signal flags and boxes of unsorted paperwork. Frank moved a cabinet and unlocked a steel door behind it. Inside was a shelf of gray harbor logs. He removed one dated 1972. The first pages held ordinary weather reports. Near the middle, the handwriting changed. The brief entries appeared only between October and March. Maribel arrived, 2 returned, 1 declined. Maribel arrived, 5 returned. All claims surrendered. Maribel arrived. Harbor keeper requested retention. Request denied. There were no vessel positions, passenger names, or departure times. Frank said the Maribel had been a small passenger ferry. In November of 1948, it disappeared in a snowstorm with 21 people aboard. No wreckage was found. For years afterward, islanders reported its lights offshore, and Frank's father quietly recorded the arrivals. I thought the ferry carried the dead. For a few minutes, that explanation gave the mystery a shape I understood. Frank said that was what his father believed too. Then, in 1961, a woman came ashore who was still alive and living on Cedar Street. She had no memory of boarding the vessel. She had lost only the memory of her son's death in Korea. After that, Frank's father understood that the passengers were not dead. They were people who had asked the lake to take something from them. Asked how, I said. Frank looked toward the locked door. Usually at the North Pier, usually after midnight, usually when they believed forgetting was the only way to keep living. He said the ferry did not erase memories, it carried them away. For a time, perhaps years, the person continued without the burden, but the memory remained tied to them, like unclaimed luggage. Eventually, the Maribel brought it back. I asked why no one remembered the ferry. Because the price of sending something away is forgetting how you did it. The boy with the red wool around his wrist had appeared in the logs before. Frank found the entry from January of 1993. Maribel arrived. 1 accepted, 2 retained. Nora Vale present. My name was written in the margin. I told Frank I had never seen the ferry before that month. He did not answer. That night, I found Eli's old tackle box beneath the basement stairs. Inside was a photograph of Ruth at 17 beside the North Pier. Eli stood behind her in a brown jacket. Around his neck was the red scarf. On the back, in my handwriting, were the words, "Last calm day before the search." There had been no search after Eli left, at least none that I remembered. The next afternoon, I searched mainland newspapers. The Island Weekly was missing several January issues, but the regional paper held one short article. Local dock electrician Elias Vale, age 41, presumed drowned after overnight rescue attempt near St. Caris North Landing. The article said a teenage boy had fallen from the pier during freezing rain. Eli went into the water after him. The boy survived. Eli did not. The boy's name was Thomas Dallow, Frank's son. When I returned to the island, Frank was waiting in the harbor office. I placed the copied article on his desk. He did not deny it. He told me Ruth had been at the pier that night. She had argued with Eli, run outside, and slipped near the edge. Thomas grabbed her coat and fell into the water instead. Eli saved Thomas, then disappeared beneath the ice moving along the breakwater. Ruth believed the accident was her fault. I blamed her during the first hours of the search. I said words no mother should say to a frightened child. 3 days later, when the lake returned Eli's red scarf but not his body, I went to the North Pier after midnight. Frank's father was still alive then. He knew what I was asking before I said it. The Maribel came through the fog. Ruth and I boarded together. I asked the ferry to take the memory of Eli's death. Ruth asked it to take the memory of causing it. The ferry accepted both because they were part of the same night. We returned before dawn believing Eli had left us. Frank had protected the story because Ruth could barely speak and I had stopped eating. He moved the newspaper copies off the island and later gave me harbor work when the arrivals began again. "You weren't supposed to remember all at once," he said. I asked what that meant. He opened the bottom drawer of the desk and removed a paper claim check sealed in a clear plastic envelope. My name was printed across the top. Below it were 3 words. Eli at the water. Frank said the ferry had been trying to return my memory for 8 years. Each time it arrived, I refused the claim. By morning, I forgot the refusal. The overnight logs were not records of passengers coming back to the island. They were records of memories being offered back to the people who had surrendered them. The next arrival would be mine. At 2:17, the radio clicked. "North Landing. This is the Maribel. We have 1 passenger to return." The fog came in low and white. Frank stood beside me at the end of the pier. Neither of us spoke as the ferry approached. The deckhand tied the line and brought out no passenger. Instead, he carried a small canvas bag. I recognized it as Eli's. For 8 years, I had remembered him packing it before he left. The deckhand placed the bag between us and held out his hand for my claim check. Frank gave it to me. I asked what would happen if I refused again. The deckhand looked toward the dark town beyond the harbor. "You'll keep the life built around the absence," he said, "but the absence will keep growing." I thought of Ruth calling every Sunday, and both of us avoiding the name of the man we believed had abandoned us. I thought of Mrs. Bell asking about Arthur's coat without knowing why. I thought of the teacher standing beside a brass plaque she no longer understood. Forgetting had not removed grief. It had taken away its shape. What remained had spread into everything. I handed the claim check to the deckhand. He did not tear it. He pressed it into my palm and closed my fingers around it. The lake moved beneath the pier. I remembered Eli running past me in freezing rain. Ruth screamed that Thomas had fallen. The red scarf came loose as Eli climbed over the rail. I saw his hand catch Thomas's coat, then the white water and the ice striking his shoulder. I remembered calling Ruth selfish and careless while men searched with lamps along the breakwater. I remembered her face. Then I remembered boarding the Maribel with her 3 nights later. Ruth had held my hand the entire time. I had been the one who asked the ferry to take the memory from both of us. The memory returned without drama. The harbor did not change. There was only the truth, heavy and complete. Inside the bag were his keys, his wallet, and the red scarf, stiff with old lake salt. The ferry departed before 3. By sunrise, the fog was gone. I called Ruth from the harbor office. I told her Eli had not left us. I told her she had not pushed Thomas. I told her what I had said during the search and that I was sorry. She was quiet for so long that I thought the call had failed. Then she began to cry. She remembered too. Frank retired the following spring. I stayed another 6 years, but never again worked alone at night. The township removed the north boarding bell and sealed the gray logs in the museum as routine weather observations. Mrs. Bell eventually remembered Arthur's drowning. The teacher remembered her daughter. Neither could explain why the memories returned in the same winter. The Maribel still comes to St. Caris. I have seen it twice since leaving the harbor, always in cold weather, always after 2 in the morning. It arrives without wake, and someone walks down the pier carrying a paper claim check they do not yet understand. Last October, I woke at 2:17 to the sound of the disconnected harbor bell drifting across town. On my kitchen table, the red scarf was wet with lake water. At 2:11 in the morning, an unplugged water gauge wrote the name of a town that had been gone for 40 years. Black Cypress, the paper said. 6 feet by dawn. The steel pen moved without touching the chart. Blue ink spread through the old paper in a thin, steady line, rising toward a number the canal outside had not reached. I knew Black Cypress only as something my father had once refused to talk about. By sunrise, I would learn why the parish had removed the name from every map it owned. That happened in September of 2009, when I was 48, and working relief nights at St. Alder Parish Pump Station No. 3 in southern Louisiana. The station sat beyond the last houses on Willow Trace Road, between a drainage canal and several hundred acres of low industrial land. During dry weather, it looked abandoned. During storm season, it kept 3 neighborhoods from filling like bathtubs. My shift ran from 7 in the evening until 7 in the morning. I watched canal levels, tested the diesel pumps, recorded rainfall, and called the parish emergency office if any gate failed to answer its controls. I had taken the job because I understood old equipment and because few people there cared about my family name. My father, Earl Reed, had worked flood control for the parish before I was born. People remembered him as the operator who mishandled the Black Cypress flood in 1969. 12 blocks went under, no one died, but families lost everything, and the settlement was never rebuilt. The parish later changed the road names and sold the higher land to warehouses and a chemical packaging company. My father was fired before the water went down. He spent the rest of his life repairing boat motors and refusing to discuss the night that ended his career. When I was 16, I asked whether he had closed the wrong gate. He stared at the workbench for a long time. Then he said, "I waited for permission." That was all. I carried those words for 32 years. I heard a confession. My sister, June, heard an excuse. We stopped speaking after his funeral because she wanted to archive his papers and I wanted to burn them. By the time I started at Pump Station 3, the papers were still sealed in boxes in her attic. The old gauge stood behind the newer digital panels. It was a waist-high circular chart recorder with 2 metal pens that had once traced canal height and pressure. The parish disconnected it in 1987, cut its copper line, removed the motor, and wrapped the cord around the base. No one moved it because it was too heavy for the narrow doors. On my first night, the senior operator, Calvin Mott, used it as a place to set his coffee. "If that thing starts working," he told me, "call a priest before you call maintenance." Calvin laughed at his own joke. I did too. 3 weeks later, the recorder began to turn. The weather was calm. A weak tropical depression south of Cuba was forecast to stay east. The canal stood at 1.8 feet, and both pumps were idle. At 2:11, I heard a soft clicking from the corner. The chart paper rotated 1 notch. I checked the cord first. It was still wrapped around the base. The cut pressure tube ended in a flattened piece of copper behind the machine. The lower pen lifted by itself. It did not draw the canal level. It wrote letters. Black Cypress. Then it moved upward and drew a line to 6 feet. A second line appeared beneath it, thinner and broken. Gate 4 closed. I opened the glass door. The pen stopped. The paper smelled faintly of river mud. I tore off the section and placed it on the desk. There was no date printed on it, only the time marks around the edge. The line began at 2:11 and ended at 5:47. At 3 in the morning, the digital canal gauge rose by 1/10 of a foot. That was normal. A distant rain shower or a pump cycling upstream could change the level slightly. By dawn, the canal was at 2 feet. Nothing else happened. Calvin arrived at 6:45. I showed him the paper. He looked at the words, then at the dead recorder. "You wrote this?" he asked. I told him I had watched the machine do it. Calvin rubbed the ink with his thumb. It did not smear. He said the recorder had once been used at Pump Station 1 and might still contain an old chart roll. When he opened the back panel, we found only dust and a family of dead wasps. He advised me to sleep more during the day. The second chart appeared 4 nights later. This time, the recorder began at 2:11 and wrote 2 names. Black Cypress. Mercy Row. Mercy Row was still on modern maps. It was a narrow neighborhood east of Willow Trace, mostly raised houses occupied by retirees and families who had lived there before the industrial park arrived. The paper predicted 3.2 feet at Mercy Row by 4:30. At 4:12, a thunderstorm formed directly over the parish. It had not been on the earlier radar. Rain struck the station roof hard enough to blur the windows, and the digital level climbed from 2 feet to 3.2 in 18 minutes. The recorder's prediction was exact. Then, at 4:30, both pens dropped and the paper stopped. I called Calvin before he left home. He drove out in the rain and checked every panel. The recorder had no motor, no pressure source, and no battery compartment. We found no radio receiver or hidden wiring. Calvin removed both pens and locked them in his truck. The next night, the recorder wrote without them. The lines appeared as shallow blue grooves in the paper, as though the ink had risen from inside the sheet. Pump 2 lost. West Canal reversing. At 1:30 the following afternoon, Pump 2 threw a bearing and shut down. At 3, a strong south wind pushed water backward through the West Canal. The tropical depression changed course that evening. It became Tropical Storm Helen and began moving toward the Louisiana coast. The parish emergency office placed every pump station on 24-hour staffing. Calvin took the day shift. I stayed on nights. Before leaving, he stood beside the dead recorder and watched the new chart turn beneath the glass. "What did your father tell you about Black Cypress?" he asked. I said he had waited for permission. Calvin looked toward the canal windows. "My uncle lived there. he said. He never blamed Earl Reed. That was the first time anyone had spoken my father's name inside the station without lowering their voice. I asked who his uncle blamed. Calvin said, the people who gave the permission. He would not explain further. That afternoon, I read the 1969 newspaper coverage at the parish library. A stalled hurricane had dropped nearly 20 inches of rain. Black Cypress flooded after a control gate remained closed for hours. The inquiry blamed operator delay, poor communication, and mechanical confusion. My father's name appeared in every article. The names of his supervisors did not. A retired librarian named Mrs. Lorette saw what I was reading. She brought me a thin folder from a cabinet behind her desk. Inside was a hand-drawn map of the old drainage district. Most of Black Cypress lay beneath the present warehouses, but its eastern edge continued into Mercy Row. The modern map divided the land into new names. The water did not care. Mrs. Lorette tapped a square marked Transfer Gate 4. This used to send overflow west, she said, away from the houses. I told her Gate 4 now protected the industrial basin. Opening it during a storm would flood loading yards, storage lots, and possibly the chemical packaging plant. She nodded. That was why they closed it in '69. The newspaper said my father had failed to open the gate. Mrs. Lorette looked at me for a moment.
No,
she said. He was told not to. Her husband had been the electrician inside Pump Station 1 that night. He said my father repeatedly asked to divert the water west. The parish engineer refused because a private fuel depot had equipment in the basin. By the time the order changed, the manual drive was underwater. My father took the blame because the radio traffic had not been recorded. The engineer kept his job. The fuel company later donated land for the new parish office. I asked why no one had corrected the story. Mrs. Lorette closed the folder. People remembered, she said. They just learned which memory was expensive. I drove home and called June. We had not spoken in 2 years. When she answered, I asked whether she still had our father's boxes. She was quiet, then said yes. I told her about the recorder and the storm. I expected her to tell me I was becoming like him. Instead, she said there was something in the boxes I should have seen long ago. She brought it to the station before dark. It was not a report or a letter. It was a brass handwheel key, the kind used to release a locked gate drive. A strip of masking tape was wrapped around the handle. My father had written 5 words on it. Gate 4, do not wait. June said she found it beneath his workbench after he died. She had wanted to give it to the archive because she believed it proved he had intended to act. I told her intention did not matter if he had waited. She looked at me the way she had at the funeral. You think he stayed silent because he was guilty, she said. I think he stayed silent because they taught him no one would believe him. Outside, the first rain bands from Helen crossed the parish. At 2:11, the dead recorder began again. This time, the paper filled quickly. Black Cypress, 6 feet by dawn. Mercy Row, 5.4. Pump 2 lost. East feed blocked. Gate 4 closed by order. At the bottom, beneath the rising lines, the recorder wrote my name. Mason Reed present. June stood beside me while the paper turned. Neither of us touched it. The emergency office called at 2:20. Helen had slowed over the coast. Rainfall totals might exceed the pump's capacity. I was instructed to keep Gate 4 closed, unless the parish director personally authorized diversion into the industrial basin. The wording was almost identical to the order my father had received. By 3, Pump 2 began vibrating. Calvin called from home and told me the replacement bearing would not hold under full load. I reduced speed, but the canal climbed faster. At 3:18, the digital gauge matched the recorder's line exactly. The chart was not replaying 1969. It was measuring the night ahead. I called the emergency office and requested permission to open Gate 4. The duty coordinator told me the industrial basin contained chemical drums and electrical equipment. Flooding it could cost millions and create a contamination risk. I told him Mercy Row was already taking water through the street drains. He said evacuation teams were moving residents. On the camera feed, I saw an elderly man standing knee-deep beside a stalled car. Behind him, porch lights shone through rain nearly horizontal in the wind. The coordinator repeated the order. "Keep gate 4 closed. At 3:41, pump 2 failed." The room changed sound. One diesel engine wound down, and the remaining pump took the full weight of the canal. The concrete floor trembled beneath my boots. The recorder wrote another line. "Manual drive lost at 4:10. I had 29 minutes. The electric motor for gate 4 had not worked in years. If the gate had to be opened, 2 people were supposed to carry the portable drive to the west platform and engage it by hand. Calvin was 40 minutes away. The road was already flooding. June said she would help. I told her to stay in the control room and keep the emergency line open. She took our father's brass key from the desk and placed it in my hand. "Don't wait," she said. The west platform stood beyond the pump house beneath a corrugated roof. Rain blew through the open sides. The transfer gate's manual housing was coated with rust and old grease. Water moved below it in 2 directions at once, brown canal flow pressing against black storm surge. I fitted the brass key into the lock. It turned as though it had been used the day before. Inside the housing, the release chain was already tight. I attached the portable drive and pulled the starter cord. The engine coughed once, then failed. At 4:2, I tried again. The drive started. The gate moved less than an inch before the chain jammed. Through the wall, I heard the dead recorder clicking in the control room. June shouted from the doorway that the emergency office was ordering me to stop. I asked what time the chart showed. 4:10, she said. I shut down the drive and opened the gear cover. A broken cotter pin had slipped between 2 teeth. I removed it with pliers, restarted the engine, and engaged the chain. This time, the gate rose. Water struck the west channel with a low, continuous force. The sound was not like a crash. It was like a long breath being released beneath the ground. The industrial basin filled first. Security lights went out 1 row at a time. Empty trailers shifted against their blocks. The chemical plant's containment wall held, though several storage yards disappeared beneath muddy water. On the Mercy Row camera, the street level stopped rising. At 4:10, the manual drive was still running. The prediction had changed. I returned to the control room soaked to the skin. June stood beside the recorder. The line marked Black Cypress had stopped at 3.1 feet. The line marked Mercy Row had stopped at 2.8. Below them, new words appeared slowly. Gate 4 open. Then the recorder wrote my father's name. Earl Reed, relieved. I watched the letters until the paper stopped moving. By noon, the storm had moved north. No houses in Mercy Row were lost. The industrial park suffered several $1 million in damage, mostly to vehicles, packaging stock, and electrical systems. The parish suspended me before I left the station. For 6 months, lawyers argued over whether I had prevented a disaster or caused one. The emergency recordings supported every order I had disobeyed. The flood maps supported every reason I had disobeyed them. I never worked for the parish again. A state review later found that Gate 4 should have been part of the emergency diversion plan all along. The report mentioned the Black Cypress flood and described the 1969 inquiry as incomplete. It did not clear my father by name, but it removed the sentence that blamed him alone. June and I gave his papers to the state archive together. We kept the brass key. Calvin became supervisor of Pump Station 3 and removed the dead recorder. The crew found no ink reservoir, drive motor, or connection to any water line. The circular charts were sent to me because no agency wanted them in its files. I stored them in a flat box beneath my bed. For several years, nothing changed. During a dry August night, I woke at 2:11 to paper turning. The box was still closed. Inside, the final chart from Pump Station 3 had gained a new blue line. It began beyond the printed edge, in a place where the recorder could never have written. The line was labeled Marrow Bend. I had never heard the name. The next morning, I found Marrow Bend on a 1948 drainage map. My granddaughter's school stands there now.